Hey, greetings and welcome to April 17th. This is a Friday, I guess. And this is going to be lecture one. We're going to have just a few more lectures actually for the rest of the semester. And so I think we'll probably have two today and then about three on Monday. Then you'll have a video to watch, a TED Talk to respond to next week as well. It's a really important TED Talk given some of the topics that we're exploring when it comes to ethics and living in pursuit of the right, good, true, and noble. So let me start off today with just a reminder about why we're doing what we're doing in terms of today's lecture set. Is that we've made the shift. Okay, we've talked about, and I mentioned this in yesterday's lectures. We've made the shift from, we talked about how stories form us, how we understand our lives within the context of our stories. We talked about the unique story of religion and how religion is uniquely formative for people to whom religion matters, right? And then even beyond that, it's not as though you can escape religion because religion shows up in a variety of different ways. So trying to understand the formative nature of religion. Then we made a shift to talking about pluralism, living in the plurality of stories, specifically religiously. And then we spent some time talking about the Christian story, how the Christian story uniquely forms us with a below-the-line world, so that the above-the-line stuff that emerges from that are consistent and coherent with the below-the-line realities. And then we spent some time talking about living formed by our stories. And we talked about the unique way in which spiritual formation shapes and forms our lives so that we can live fully into the story for which we've been created and called. And that's specifically related to the Christian story. Now we're talking about ethics. And ethics is about coherence. Ethics is about ensuring that the actions that happen above the line are coherent with the world below the line. And that what we do above the line is in pursuit of the right, good, true, and noble. That somehow, some way, how we live, how we act, is to the benefit or the flourishing of humanity. Ethics wants to ask that question consistently. Is the stance I'm taking, the actions I'm participating in, do they align with what we believe, and we being hopefully a fairly inclusive term, but for many people it's fairly exclusive, we being a small group of people believe that it is the right, good, true, and noble. And I want to give you just a few thoughts. If you're in lecture set 6, I'm going to talk a little bit about ethical discourse. And so you're going to start down that first page of notes, right there towards the top, and it says, ethical discourse is the means through which we as humans attempt to define what is right, good, true, and noble. Translating what is below into what is above. And it's our capacity to engage and converse meaningfully about how we understand ethics to work itself out, to manifest itself in the lives of people and in the lives of communities. There's a couple things that I want to suggest to us that we ought to keep in mind as we begin this conversation about ethics. The first one of which is there coherence? Meaning, is there something coherent that holds together the line of thought as we define what is right, good, true, and noble? Meaning this, too often we tend to think in terms of ethics in situational terms. So a situation demands a certain set of activities. I want to ask, beyond situation, is there something more guiding the decisions we make in whatever situations we encounter about the right, good, true, and noble? So I want to give you an example of what I mean by coherence. Jesus is in one of the synagogues, and a man comes to him with a withered hand on the Sabbath. And the Sabbath is a day in which there was no work to be done, and the assumption is no healing was to be done either. And there were the assumptions of the religious leaders that there's other days in which this man with the withered hand could be healed. And yet Jesus on the Sabbath heals the man. Challenged by that, by the religious leaders, he then asks the question of coherence, ethical coherence. He says, if your donkey falls in a pit, are you going to let him lay there, or are you going to help him out? And if you would do this, if you would extend mercy to the donkey in the pit, why wouldn't you do so to someone who is damaged and in need? And what he's pointing at is the discrepancy between how they understand the motivations behind their actions. One can suggest that there are certain times which you shouldn't do certain things, but when you press people on, you begin to realize that the way in which they understand ethical discourse and the way it works itself out lacks a sense of coherence. We see that a lot in today's world. Christians who make claims, but then when are proposed by a political issue, the coherence of why they would make certain decisions breaks down, and they say, no, I wouldn't do that, or yes, I wouldn't do, without the understanding of the lack of coherence of the way nuance works in the conversation about ethics. Is there flex? Meaning, as we consider what ethical discourse should look like, is there an openness to expressions of ethics that might not fit a rigid understand of ethical action? And I want to use an example of this. To an ancient Jew, the Jews were righteous, Samaritans were dogs, right? They were, in their terms, half-breeds. They were unrighteous. And yet when Jesus tells the story of a good neighbor, he talks about the priest and the Levite as those who pass by the man in need on the side of the road. And then he implicates the Samaritan in terms of righteous, good, right, true, and noble behavior by helping out the man in the ditch. Does our ethical worldview have the kind of flex where we can integrate new information and new understandings that at times would seem at odds with our prevailing notions, where we can see the right, good, true, and noble outside of our strictly defined boundaries? That's another question that we have to ask about ethics. Is there a sense of betrayal to what we say we believe about the world and our ethical treatment? I want to use the United States as an example of this. The below the line suggests that all men are created equal. That is rooted in how we understand how we understood as America was being constituted, how we understood the human actions and the human endeavors. And so, but the actions we took lacked a sense of coherence, right? There was a betrayal, meaning we meant all men were created equal. All white landowning men were created equal. What that didn't translate into the actions and how we would treat slaves, how we would treat those indigenous people and groups that lived in the Americas prior to them being founded. So there was a sense of betrayal to what we say we believe here and how we embodied that above the line. So ethics needs to ask the hard questions. Are we betraying what we say we believe because of political expediency, economic necessity? You're even seeing that as people wrestle with the questions about the pandemic. Like, they're asking questions, what does it mean to quarantine, to sacrifice financially the needs, when in fact there could be great loss of life if we're open up too quickly? So they're asking questions about this and this matching one another. Is there a sense of imposition, or is it internally motivated? Ethics needs to ask the question, are these ethics being imposed by us by a certain power beyond us, or are they internally motivated? Is there something deep within that inspires the kind of behaviors that are consistent? And then, what are the implications of social media currently on our ethical discourse? And in what ways does that social media drive the wedge of divisiveness, comparison, competition, and envy? And how does that influence and affect our capacity to have meaningful ethical discourse? These are all questions we need to wrestle with as we're talking about what it means to live ethically. And so, is there coherence? Does it connect? Does it match? Is there flex? Is it open to new understandings of the world around us as we experience the world? Or is it so strict and stringent that there is no possibility for understanding nuance? Is there a sense of betrayal? Is what we saying here unmatched by what we do here? Is there an imposition or an internal motivation? I would hope that our ethics are internally motivated, and yet what role does external imposition of ethics factor in the lives of those who follow? And then what is the implications for how we actually converse about these things? This is what is at stake in terms of our conversation about ethics, and we'll explore these a little bit further as we move into the next lecture.